We're recording? Is this on? Okay, it's working, isn't it? I'm just joking. I knew it was working the whole time. How you guys doing, right? So here we are back in the wilderness, right? Beautiful experience out here. Beautiful view. It is wonderful, right? We're going to continue on our learning of the Torah passage that we've been focusing on, which is here we are as we're ascending, going through the county of the Omer, and we're getting ready for what Hag? That's right, Shavuot, receiving of the Torah, which, I have two wonderful holidays I get to rejoice in a very unique way. One, my daughter was born on Erev Pesach, and number two, my other daughter was born 3 days before Shavuot, which is actually when Moses was preaching to the people about receiving the covenant. I said preaching, I meant preaching. Don't you like that? I use words sometimes and I screw up, but that's okay, because it's all right. We can do it, okay? So, here we are. We're in this passage here in Tet Vav, and now we're in Tet Zayin, and we're at verse Daled, and we're going to continue going on and learning about the journeys and the focusing on what goes on here. What is so important for us to learn and know, we're going to sit there and see and focus on a lot about these things so we can keep this in our head and put in our minds the reality of what we need to know and understand. So without further ado, let's pray. Adonai, Lord God, I really pray against the enemy. I pray that we would put our hearts to know the Torah, to observe the commandments, to observe the statutes, and that we will walk in righteousness all the days of our life. Deliver us out of the hands of the enemy. Deliver us out of the wicked doctrines of men, and help us to embrace the Torah as we ought to in fullness. And help us to keep the commandments and walk in righteousness. Amen. One of the biggest things that we have a problem with in today's society is really the lack of understanding the Torah. And one of the major problems of the lack of understanding Torah is really the whole makeup of why the Torah was set up the way it was and what really is going on. Because for people that read the Torah, they have this misconceived idea in thinking that the Torah was just made for the Jewish people and that was it. And that's why you feel a lot of people who are giving people the reasons as to why they don't want to be a part of keeping the Torah, or why they think that it's not a part of them because they think it's Jewish, and they have a misunderstanding of this. The reality that we find here, and this is what we have to really get at and really see, is the fact of why was Moses going and talking about things like the Sabbath? And what was the point of him bringing up all of these issues, especially as we get into the part where he teaches us about aspects of learning about how Shabbat is to be observed and kept. And that is because it was the mixed multitude that was now a part of Israel. It had nothing to do with Israel by itself. It had to do with everybody, all the Jews and Gentiles who collectively together had to go through and have a laid out foundation of what was required of them as a community and as a body. And this is one of the reasons why it's so screwed up in today's, because it's not taught this way. People aren't seeing the right perspective of what was really going on here and what's happening here. And we see this as we learn. It says, Vayimer Adonai el Moshe. So the Lord speaks in Moshe. He says, Hineni mamtir lechem. Behold, I'm raining for you bread. Min hashemayim, from heaven. V'yatzei ha'am, and the people went forth for laktu, to gather and collect davar yom, the matter of the day, bayomom, on its day. Lama'an, in order, anasehu, that he may test him. Vayelech b'torati, will he walk in my teachings, ve'im lo, and if not. So what was the biggest thing we learned from this passage in the Torah is the first thing that starts to happen in the wilderness is God is actually testing the people to see if they're going to walk in his ways or not. And how does God test us? And the simple answer is he teaches us his mitzvahs. He teaches us his commandments. And the response of that testing is, do we respond to it by positively, actively keeping the commandments, or do we go about not listening and not following the instructions given? And this really gives us a really good example of understanding the fact that this is how we as parents are to teach the attitude of testing our children, right? You see, the enemy, when the enemy seeks to test mankind, his attitude is trying to confuse you, trying to manipulate you, and trying to see if he can get you to violate the Torah. Whereas God's word, his attitude is trying to see us to observe and keep and follow by instructing us and giving us wisdom and understanding, because he wants us to see if we're going to observe it and keep it. Now, remember, God already knows what you're going to do. But the point is, do we really know what we're going to do? And we don't. We don't know until we are actively brought forth into a testing application. And it's funny, it's like today I was out and there's a bunch of guys who were out learning saws and axes, and they were going through a big practicum to see if they really retained the information that they got in the classroom setting, as well as the information the instructors were giving them right there in front of them. And how were they going to go about failing these tree parts? Well, not failing, I should say. They were more like, utilizing techniques to break up and destroy the firewood in the area to be able to see what's going to happen. What are they going to do in these scenarios? How are they going to do with situations where they have fallen trees that have come into an area where it's blocking the trail? And then, of course, how are they going to cut it up? What are going to be the attributes that are going to be against them or for them? Whether the gravity is going to be pulling down, trying to pinch upon the log. Will they need to saw upward on top of the tree? Will they need to saw underneath the tree? And the different techniques and stuff that they use and stuff, which is, chipping off the barks and stuff, presetting it before they start to saw the tree up. And all of these things is that attitude of the practicum, seeing how well you're going to perform in a physical situation by being put underneath that situation. And we see in the Torah, that was what was given to Israel. Israel was given a situation by which Jews and Gentiles were given the standards and the statutes of how they were going to observe and follow the Torah by being given one of their first little rules that was going to give them a daily routine, and that was gathering the manna that was going to be rained down from heaven. It says, V'haya bayom hashishi, and was on the sixth day, Hakinu, they shall prepare et asher, that which ya'avu, they shall bring, v'haya mishnei, and it shall be double al asher yelakuktu yom yom, that which they collected day and day after day. So notice the Torah says that Yom Shishi, that they were to make sure that they prepare and collect everything they need for the eating. Okay? And that's because they were in a tent situation environment. They had a bunch of tents set up. They had a whole campsites all over the place. And so they had to have an area where they prepared their food, and they had an area where they would bring the food to sit down and eat. And that was so that they would have an evening meal set up, and they would have an afternoon meal set up, so that what they could do is they could have the Shabbat evening meal. And after that, they would go to a tent and they would listen to the reading of the Torah, and they would listen to the teachings of the Torah. And when they would return back to their tent, they'd be able to eat their afternoon meal, which would sustain them during the time period of Shabbat. It says, Vayimer Moshe, and Moshe said, Va'Aaron, El kol b'nei Israel, and to all of the children of Israel, Be'erev, Yadavtim, ki Adonai hutzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, that you should know the Lord has brought you forth from the land of Egypt. Uboker uritim, in the morning you shall see et kavod Adonai, the glory of the Lord. Beshamo, when is hearing et tolnatechem, your complaints, al Adonai, against the Lord. V'nachnu ma ki telenu aleinu, and we, what are we that you complain against us? So Moshe and Aaron were really disturbed because the people were complaining at just the giving of the laws of how they're going to observe the Sabbath. And that's how sometimes people are. They take the Sabbath laws and they listen to what's being said, and they maltreat them. They look at them from the attitude of like, oh my gosh, are you serious? Do we really have to keep all of these rules and these regulations? And so they start having this bitter attitude towards the rules of how they're supposed to apply themselves when it comes to keeping on the Sabbath. And this was the thing that he was saying, is that the people were complaining, and he didn't understand why were these people taking out all this aggression on Moshe and Aaron as if they were the source of all of these rules and not God. And then he goes to say here, Vayimer Moshe, and Moshe said, Betet Adonai, when the Lord is giving lechem to you, be'erev, in the evening, besar le'echol, to eat, ve'lechem, and lechem baboker, in the morning, lishboa, for satisfaction. The word shavah is the word that literally means to be sated. And we learn in the Torah that bread is actually a specific item that we learn actually is what gives us the nutrients that we need, that gives us a long time period of being able to be satisfied. That's why we even look at doctors when they talk about the health and stuff. What do they say is one of the big part of your healthy diet is grains, right? And we read and we learn from the material that exists out there that, yeah, that needing grains and stuff and needing the things that comes from wheat and barley and stuff, those are the things that give us a satisfying food abilities. It's not meat, it's not vegetables. All those things are edible, they're good for our health. Certain things give us the longevity, and that's because, eating bread, you have the bread turning into glucose, and that glucose then goes in, and during that time period, the cholesterols and all the stuff that's in there that's needed for our body gives us that strength and ability to be able to have the vigor and stuff to move forward and do a daily task and work. So he says here that, notice that basar was not considered for satisfaction, but the actual bread is for satisfaction. He says, B'shemo Adonai, when the Lord is hearing, et toletechem, your complaints, asher atem alani, which you are complaining alav against him. So notice that he wanted to compare the fact that all the complaining they were doing, it wasn't really against Aaron and Moses. They were just the people trying to give you what your laws or how you're supposed to live and keep, but it was God who eventually was the source of all of their real complaints that they were fighting against. And that's why he says, Nachnu, ma'aleinu, we, what? It's not against us, toletechem, that you're complaining, ki al Adonai, but against the Lord. Because why? Because Adonai in heaven, he's the source of all those rules. And he's the one who created those rules and gave us those rules to abide by. And so when people fight against these very things, well, they're not fighting men. And that's one of the things you unfortunately will find. I can't tell you how many times I run into people and stuff, and they rather fight with you in arguments rather than listen and really think about what it is they need to do and fix for themselves and how they need to follow and listen for their own selves and their own good. And some of the worst arguments I hear people say is like, well, the Spirit has not convicted me. And I would say, well, that's called emotionalism, because in emotionalism, your mind is the one that you think is doing the job of how you're supposed to be, going off of how you feel. But reality is, when we read something and we see that the reading says you shall keep it and you're not keeping it, well, if you're searing your conscience by trying to say that that's not about your need to follow, you're not to do it, it's that you don't feel the drive of having to do it, you're just lying to yourself, because these are things that we are to follow and keep because it's what the word says and teaches. So he goes to say, Vayimer Moshe el Aaron, and Moshe said unto Aaron, Emor el kol adat ben Israel, saying to all the congregation of the children of Israel, Hivru lifnei Adonai, draw near before the Lord, ki shema et toletecha, for he has heard your complaints. Vihi kadavar Aaron, and it was according to Aaron, el kol adat ben Israel, all the congregation of the children of Israel, lifenu el hamidbar, and they turned unto the wilderness, vihine kavod Adonai nira ba'anan. The glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Vayidaber Adonai, and the Lord spoke unto Moshe Lemor, saying. So what are we supposed to understand is that God sees everything, right? He knows what a person's voice is really speaking when they're trying to say what they're trying to say, right? He reads through our crap. He reads through all the garbage and all the hidden things that people try to think they're saying that they don't realize, they're not being, hidden from. And he said he was going to force the people to face what it is that they were dealing with. So it says, Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe, the Lord spoke to Moshe Lemor, saying, Shemati et tolanot, I've heard the outcries, the complaints of the Bnei Israel. Deber Alehem, speaking to them, Lemor, saying, Ben Arbaim. So Ben Arbaim, this time period is not afternoon, but rather it's the twilight time periods between both dawn and dusk. Tochlu, so this is specifically the dawn, the dusk part. Tochlu basar, you shall eat basar. Uva boker bishavua, you shall be satisfied lechem, with bread. V'yadatem, and you shall know Adonai Elohechem, the Lord is your God. So notice the fact of this whole thing is that, was he really saying for them to eat basar? Because remember this, they were the ones complaining, oh, the pot of meat, oh, we ate to satisfaction, right? These guys were complaining about their life changes that were being made upon them because of the change of situation and their background and the environment that was taking place. And this is why we have to realize that God is really huge on teaching us how to learn true psychology. And we see that within how even we as parents talk to our kids. Not every time do we literally mean exactly what we're literally saying to our kids, because our kids, if they know us real well, they should understand that's not what he's saying, right? Because notice, he didn't say, eat flesh to satisfaction in the evening. He says, you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be satisfied with bread. Notice the bread is the only thing that you talked about that gave satisfaction, right? So then he goes and says, Vihi be'erev, ta'al shalav, there ascended the quail, v'tikas et machne, and it covered the camp. Baboker, in the morning, hayat shikvat tal, there was a layer of dew, saviv lamachne, that was surrounding the camp. V'ta'al shikvat ta'al, and there ascended a layer of dew. V'hinei al penei midbar, was on the face of the wilderness. Dak mechopas, that was crackling. Dak kekafar, and it was thin like frost. Al haaretz, upon the earth. V'eru b'nei Israel, and the children of Israel saw. V'emru, and they said, Ish el achiv, each man to his brother. Man hu. So it's a funny statement that he says manhu, right? And the reason why I asked this question is, it's a funny statement, is what is man, right? In Hebrew, there is no such thing in essence of something that we would say is man, right? But we know that when we read later on in the Torah, for example, in Tet Zayin verse Lamed Aleph, it says, Vayikru b'nei Bet Israel, and the house of Israel called Et Shemot's name Man, right? So here we have the thing that says Manhu, right? Man would be almost like they already identified it, right? But then if you read on, it says Ki lo yadu mahu, for they didn't know what it is, right? So they, what would saying something by giving an attribution to it, yet not really knowing what it is, right? And this is an important thing to understand, because man doesn't make sense here, right? And this is an important thing to think about and focus on as to why this doesn't make sense, because there's the Hebrew word man, there is no man, right? Because they didn't know what it was. And the way Hebrew works, whenever you know what something is, you identify it by its characteristics and by its function. You know, that's why you called a cake an uga, because it means to make something round. Therefore, that's why you called ugot, right? You call mayim because it comes from the word maye, which means to liquefy. Therefore, that's why it's called mayim, because it's water. It's liquefied, all right? So it's something to think about, just throwing this out there. So then he goes to say, Ve'emer Moshe Elohim, and Moshe says unto them, Hu halechem, it is the bread, asher natan Adonai, which the Lord has given lechem to you, la'achla. So what is achla? So there's many different words for food. Ma'achal is the Hebrew word for food, but it literally means a source of food. So that means anything that's called a ma'achal is called a source of food. It means it is something that has an ability to be used as a source for eating from. And then you have the word ochel, which is the generic word that just means food in general. And then you have the word achla, which means a food that sustains. So things that are considered sustaining foods are called achla, right? So he says here, it says, the Lord has given to you achla, sustaining food. This is the thing which the Lord commanded. Liktu mimenu, to collect from it, ish la piachlo, each man according to his eating. Omer la gogelet, a tenth of an ephah, the skull mispar numbered nefshotechem, of your souls. Ish la asher, to whomever is ba'holo, that's in his tent, tikatchu, you shall take. Now notice this, how does God treat us versus how does man treat man? In here the Torah says, each man according to his eating. You notice how a man doesn't treat man that way? He will give you as least amount as possible, or he'll give you what he thinks is okay for the moment, but not sufficient. But the Torah says that God gives us each man according to his eating. So if you're a guy who eats a lot, God would give you that kind of food to make sure that you had according to how much you eat. If you're a person who doesn't eat as much, you were given as much food as needed for you to eat and be satisfied, right? That goes to show you the difference between God's version of grace and mercy versus mankind. So he says, Vaisu Ken, and they did this, Bnei Israel, Veilachtu Hamidbar, and they collected Marbe much, Mamit, and those who collected little. Vaimdu, and they measured Ba'omer, Lo Haidif, they did not remain over Hamarbe, those who had much, Hamamit, and those who had little. Why was there not anybody lacking here? And the answer simply is because those who had much gave to whoever was lacking, which they didn't. There are some people out there that don't even have a clue of how much they should be taking because they don't either know the different elements of their cooking. Maybe they don't do as much cooking. A lot of people out there, I know people out there don't cook at all. All they've ever done is eat out. And they have no idea with that context of what it means to really make sure they had enough to be satisfied and they had enough to be able to eat based upon that number of what they needed. And the Torah basically shows us, like in the book of Acts, everyone was fed and satisfied. They were all given what was needed. Everyone was given exactly the necessities of what they were needing. Nobody was lacking in any way, shape, or form. Which shows us that everyone treated their own things as if it didn't belong to them. And I'm not saying it different, like as if like they didn't own it, but they treated, if they had stuff they didn't use or stuff they had an extra amount of, they were willfully giving it to those who had need and those who were lacking. And that's exactly what the book of Acts says with how the apostles were when the Talmudim at the time period were dealing with a lot of persecutions, and everybody who had land would start selling their land and using that money to kind of help out those who had lack and those who had need. And so the Torah says that exactly is how the body, both the Jews and Gentiles, were being treated, is that there was a making sure that everyone had, each man according to what he lacked, that he had each person his necessities met. That's why it says, Lo chasir ish la piachlo, there was no lacking each man according to his eating, lachtu, they took. So everyone had exactly what was needed, no matter how much that person ate, they had enough. Moshe said of them, Ish ayoter mimenu ad boker, don't let anything remain until morning. V'lo shamu eli Moshe, they would not listen unto Moshe. V'yotiru anashim, and the men left over mimenu from it ad boker. Vayirum, and it rose up toilim worms. Vayavash, and it stank. V'ktsof, and he was angry aleihem Moshe. So why was Moshe angry? Well, obviously because the fact that the people weren't willing to obey the very decree he was giving. And it wasn't from him. It wasn't his laws. It wasn't his statutes. He was giving commandments that he was being told by God to tell the people. And once again, the people were being tested. Would they really follow and obey the things they were taught? Or would they just go do their own thing? That really goes to show us that how are people tested on a daily basis? Maybe you watch a video of somebody who teaches things in the Torah, and you read in the Torah and you see what's being said, and you're being tested if you should keep kosher, and you don't keep kosher. These are the things you have to realize, that every time we're being taught to do something positive, or even that we're to refrain from something that's negative, right? All of these things, just like these people would refrain from leaving anything until morning, right? And the people wouldn't listen. And Moshe was angry because the people weren't listening. It says, Vaylachtu oto, and they collected it, baboker, each and every morning. Ish kapiachlo, each man according to his eating. V'cham hashemesh, and the heat of the sun, namas, it would melt. So they didn't have time to just collect all day long. They had from morning all the way up until noon, because after that, it would melt and disappear, and the people could not go out and collect anything afterwards. It says, Vihi b'yom ha'shishi, was on the 6th day, lachtu, they collected lechem, mishnei double, shnei ha'omer, 2 omers, le'echad, ve'vu, And they came, called Nasei Ha'eda, all the sages of the assembly, Ve'igdu LaMoshe, and they told the Moshe. Ve'emer leim, and he said unto them, Hu asher diber Adonai Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh. It is a holy Sabbath, l'Adonai, to the Lord Machar, tomorrow. Et asher tofu, that which you will bake, afu bake. Vet asher tavshalu, that which you shall cook, bashalu, shall cook. So baking and cooking have to be done before the Sabbath. You cannot do it on Shabbat. Ve'et kol ha'odef, that which is left over, yanichu lechem mishmerd ad boker, you shall leave for yourself for a charge until the boker, the morning. So that's why we know we have two meals that we eat on the Sabbath. We have an evening meal, and we have the afternoon meal, the day meal. And that those food that was made was to be sustained and used throughout the whole time period for the Sabbath. V'nichu oto ad boker, and they made it rest until morning, kesher tzivah Moshe, as Moshe had commanded. V'lo hivish, they did not rot rima, a maggot. V'lo hayatabo, was not in it. So notice that when we walk in obedience, right, we don't get afflicted by these things. And this is exactly what happened. They walked in obedience. They didn't rot, and they didn't find any maggots in their food. And the Torah goes on to say, Vaymer Moshe alchu, eat it, hayom, today, ki Shabbat hayom, for the Sabbath is today to the Lord. Leyom lo timtzu oto b'sedei, today you will not find it in the field. Shishet yimim, 6 days, yilachtuhu, you will collect it. B'yom hashvi'i, but on the 7th day, Shabbat, the Sabbath, lo yichye, there should not be in it. Vihi b'yom hashvi'i, and it was on the 7th day, yetzu min ha'am, there went forth from the people, lichtot, to collect, velo matzu, but they didn't find. Why do people still refuse to walk in obedience, even after being told, is a very shocking thing. Because you see within it this ridiculous behavior, people not wanting to listen, and yet they know they should. They should follow. Why don't they follow? Why don't they do it? And here it was. It was the Sabbath day, and they went out to collect, thinking they were going to find manna, only to find that there was nothing. This is the thing we have to think about as importance, is why obedience is so important, and why learning to listen and learning to be a body and following the instructions of the Torah is so essentially important. And that this is why all of these things, as they were being taught to both Jews and Gentiles as they were heading towards Har Sinai, was to get everyone fully prepared in being unified and knowing how they were going to follow and keep as a group. And obviously the sad part is a lot of people didn't want to follow. So I want you to think about this. What kind of a person do you want to be? Do you want to be a person who sits there and doesn't listen and doesn't follow and doesn't hear and doesn't want to do? Or do you want to be a person that keeps and follows and does? Because this truly is the great test. I'll see you next time.